All right, so I'm excited to be here today with my new friend Molly Neuman. So Molly is the president of CD Baby and the former CMO of Downtown Music Holdings. So she leads strategy for Downtown's primary D2C business, serving millions of independent artists. And she's helped grow Songtrust to over 3 million copyrights for over 350,000 writers in 145 countries. And she's been recognized in the industry as Billboard's digital power players in women in music lists. And she started her career as a drummer in a riot girl band, Bratmobile. So she's the real deal. Molly, I'm like honored to have you on the podcast today and hear a little bit about your perspective, having, being the president of CD Baby and with your career in the music. I'm sure you've seen a lot of transformation, evolution, kind of where things have gone in the music industry. And right now there's all sorts of crazy stuff happening with AI, and the future of music is kind of crazy. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective.
So many things. Yeah, no, thank you. I've been doing this for a long time in lots of different ways, meaning I've been working in the music industry for a long time. But it is interesting, over the years, there's been sort of a through line, or I would maybe not like a through straight line, but it's like a wavy up and down line that makes a lot of sense. I think when I look back on starting as a musician, certainly in the early 90s, where, part of our motivation for our band and for me personally was to help be a part of giving more visibility to women musicians and artists and songwriters and record company executives and sound people and tour managers, and just more visibility for women in general, and where we are in the industry now all these years later. But yeah, it's been a pretty fascinating journey,
I bet. So maybe you could take us a little bit behind the scenes, and share a little bit about your story about starting as a musician and becoming the president of CD Baby.
Yeah, sure. So I started, I was a college student. I was, ambitious in wanting to meet new people. My best friend, who I met at college at the University of Oregon, was from Olympia, Washington. And Olympia has a pretty unique music scene and history. Even at that time, it was, very underground, but still making an impact. And there was a big connection between Olympia, Washington, and Washington, D.C., where I'm from originally, but also with other sort of high intensity music communities like Glasgow and London and Chicago, and, cities that obviously London and New York and LA you think of as, music cities, and obviously Nashville as well. But, sort of these different, in Seattle has a big identity for music. Olympia's just an hour and change away, but had its own identity. And a lot of that was rooted in finding space and making space for artists and for music that wasn't mainstream, wasn't, certainly was not what major record companies were signing. And that was something that was really attractive to me. I've always been someone who kind of, maybe the way I grew up, if something wasn't being done, there was certainly no barrier to you trying. Didn't mean that you were going to be successful, but trying was always encouraged. But also finding that reality that, many women weren't as encouraged as men, perhaps. And I think that's true for other underrepresented, categories of, identity. And so that was something that was really motivating to me. And the time in the world where political activism was making an impact. So if you think back on sort of the anti-apartheid movement, there was a lot of support in creative communities for finding ways to support the change in South Africa. And that was another sort of zone of inspiration for me. So, as I started making music and we started our band, and our band was all women, and we were connecting with other bands that were all women or mostly women. Fanzines were a thing. So we were finding ways to communicate and network with, this is pre-internet too, right? So finding ways to create community that were, very tangible, but also, about playing live and, so going to new towns and finding bands that were, maybe had shared values. Probably not the way that we described it then, but that's probably the way I think about it now. And independence and sort of just that youthful energy, finding people. Like, we played on our first tour in Sioux City, Iowa. and
Really?
not a place. Oh yeah,
I grew up in Vermilion, South Dakota. So that was like 45 minutes away. It was like what part of my stomping grounds growing up.
I wonder if you ever made your way to Minot, North Dakota, right? Like I've
Okay.
played in, is it where did we played Fargo, we played Minot, we played Sioux City. We did a lot of like at the, the central, Midwest and Western states because we were from the Northwest, primarily. But just to go back to Sioux City, we rolled through town and we were like, no one's gonna come to the show. Number one. Then we played, then we got to the venue and there were kids milling about. And then the opening band played and they were doing a circle pit. And we were like, oh no, they're going to hate us. It's just not going to go well. And by the time we played, it was mania. I mean, people were slam dancing, they were stage diving. They loved it. And we couldn't believe what was going on. We didn't have an album out. We had a single and we had a bunch of songs that we had written. And it was, but it transformed our whole emotional state. We're like, oh my God, this is incredible. So that is how I got my start, through various paths to different, okay, well, I graduated college, got to get a job. Okay, I'm going to work part-time doing this. I really wanted to tour still. But eventually touring, really took its toll. It was not commercially successful, let's put it that way, by any means. And so I ended up getting a real job. And that one of my first opportunities was to work at Lookout Records, which was the first label of Green Day. And Green Day at that time had already signed to Warner Brothers Reprise Records, but they were blowing up with Dookie, and the label needed sort of a different approach. And so my qualification, that self-described qualification, was that I had worked anywhere else. Like everyone who worked there had never worked anywhere else. And so I had worked in offices, I had worked in, different sort of organizations. I was like, okay, we need a filing system. We need a database. We need to, support the other artists that were on the label. And that was, in the 90s when things in independent music were very successful. CDs were the format of record, if you will, and were high margin products. They were not too expensive to make, and they were being sold at quite a high retail price, which obviously undermined the industry eventually when consumers realized that that was not a sort of fair shake, or wasn't the right balance economically, right? And so file sharing became, had the massive impact that it did in the music industry at the end of the 90s. And, sort of like the rapid decline happened with digital music being introduced legally in the early 2000s. And that sort of like return that we have seen now, but it's a completely transformed industry, right? So first we had downloads that you paid for, which I think probably most Gen Z, Gen Alpha, even many millennials might be like, paid for downloads? Like, that's so weird. Because streaming was not, even though Rhapsody was probably the first streaming service that was legal, it didn't really catch on until Spotify entered the US. And the platform and the product, I think, was a fit for, where consumers were at that time and music fans. And, now all these years later, we have lots of choice in streaming platforms. A lot of artists are seeing the impact that that's had on their bottom lines. And, there are lots of headlines and stories and different, perspectives on that. But, it's the transformation that we're seeing. And now you mentioned, AI and what that's going to be doing for both creation and the way that we run our businesses, those of us who support artists and the industry in different ways. I think it's still uncharted. I hear a lot of expertise, that people seem to have about what the impact of AI is going to have on all of our lives in all different directions, not just music, obviously. And, I think there's still a lot to be determined, but it is having an impact. And so I think one of the ways that I've tried to approach my career is mostly when a new opportunity or a new way of doing something is presented, I try to be open to it so that I'm not stuck in the past and left behind. But, that's scary. There's a lot of fear right now, I think, in lots of different aspects of the music industry for artists.
Absolutely. Yeah, that feels like a very honest answer about kind of where things are at with AI. It's just because
I
there's,
mean, when I hear people talk about their expertise, I always, I know that there are people who are studying these things much more deeply than I am. So I can't discount their expertise by any means. But I also think grand predictions about change this early in a transformation are sometimes a little foolish in that we don't quite know. I mean, there were a lot of people who were very bullish a couple of years ago about lots of different things, right? NFTs, blockchain, all sorts of, different, platform transformations that we were going to see for the music industry that I was probably on the side of more skepticism. And so I received some criticism for that, which is fine. But I also think a couple of years later, some of those things that really took over all of our, all of the articles and all of the panels and things like that, we're not really talking about them anymore as much, right? So that doesn't mean that they're not still relevant or that for certain parts of the industry, even, for example, NFTs aren't worth consideration, or that maybe they are a good model for certain kinds of artists or certain categories of artists' lives. I think it really did. I don't know what you think, but for me, it really felt like it was taking over the discourse.
yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. And I think you're absolutely right that like, if you ever make grand predictions about the future, you're kind of just begging to look like a fool at some point. I've seen some videos on YouTube of talk shows where they're talking about the internet in the early days, and people are kind of like, oh, like this internet thing, like, have you heard of radio?
No, I know, but there's so much I mean, I think that's a really good point too, because it's also important to review things that have impacted our industry, especially from the industry perspective, right? So where you see many companies, as the original Napster was, taking hold and like really impacting the paradigm, the infrastructure, the way that we thought of things, and the money, right? The main angle for response was, punitive. And I think most of us who have been through that, or who were even closer than I was to it, recognize that that was probably not the right way to handle things. That, going after individuals for sharing, songs that they found. And, I mean, there's probably a different way that that could have been managed. But, when things are changing so quickly and you're looking at, oh, what does this mean for my business, for my customers, for my artists? It's not, it's rational, but it's not, I think at least now we seem to have been thinking a little bit more about, okay, this is happening. How can we make it work? Whether it's with Gen AI and, all the models that have been built around artists' work, or the way that we scale the work that we do to support all the creativity that's happening. And I think that's more where I'm focused, because obviously I work in a platform with a platform that supports millions of, artists who have, created millions and millions of works. And, how can we be partners with the industry and with those artists to have the benefit and value of all of the change that's happening? My personal taste, and this might be where I sound much, I date myself, like I personally don't see too much that's of interest of like listening to robots create music in the style of something that, whether I like a lot or was a part of or whatever. But, maybe I just don't see that yet. So I don't know. That's kind of probably the more curmudgeonly angle. Whereas I do see the technology that we have now helping artists create music at maybe a higher sonic quality, or, different, certainly being on the industry side of things for so long, with better data quality and better attribution. And we really do have so much room for human error still in this industry, like whether they just enter a split wrong when they're registering a work with their performance society or whatever it's going to be. There are still ways you think, yeah, maybe technology could help us with that, sooner than later.
Got it. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So it sounds like what you're saying is that you haven't necessarily seen yet the appeal of just having an AI computer just to generate the music completely, because
Right.
it just isn't at the same standard for the most part. It's kind of missing, it's sort of what the top 1% of music can really do. But you also think that there's some great opportunities to improve some core systems, and just like things that have a lot of opportunity to be improved in terms of like making sure that people have their splits set up correctly.
Absolutely. I mean, and also think about, I don't know if you saw the news today, but one of the biggest bands from the 90s and early 2000s, Oasis, is reuniting, like something that we never thought
Oh,
was
wow.
going to happen. They said the sibling rivalry and all of the things, like, like they hate each other, right? And they're brothers, and, it's never going to happen. Of course, never say never, right? Like that's probably one of the main lessons. But how many songs can we imagine have already been created in the style of Oasis that are probably pretty good? Because their formula originally was something that you, as an audience member or as a fan, I'm a big fan, could hear, like, okay, I see this reference, I see it, plus his voice is amazing, and, in my opinion, or, that the riffs are so strong. But it is somewhat predictable, like how those songs were crafted, and probably put that into a model. You're going to come up with something not too bad. But like, do you really want to listen to it? That's what I mean. Kind of like, I would rather at this stage of life. And I think one of the questions I really have about the industry, especially working in a platform like CD Baby, where we have so many artists who are creating so much new music from their, origin anyway, how much capacity truly is there for us to listen to all of this new music created by humans, all of this new music potentially created by Gen AI, and the catalog that we all love too. So, I think those are kind of the more like data driven, real questions that I'm curious about. But I don't want to say that there's not going to be some, in all likelihood, some incredible music created that, maybe, you do find passion for.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is that one thing to consider is just like the limited time that we already have to listen to music. And there's so much music, and it's exponentially growing too. There's going to be even more with AI gen, whether it's like completely devoid, it's just purely like the robot being like creating it, or if it's an extension of a human who's creating it using these tools to create faster. The end thing is still the same, which is more music, more available, but we have the same amount of time in the day. And so, therefore, just like cutting through the noise, it creates a bit of a challenge, and a lot of noise, a lot more than we can listen to, unless we find a way to listen to music at 10x speed, which would probably kind of rob it of its enjoyment.
I mean, certainly, maybe people do 24 hours a day, right? But that's, I think, in our industry, one of the things also you'll hear is, some of these other sort of comparable media industries are way larger than music, right? Gaming, for example, film and TV is probably a known larger media industry. So we're also competing with all of those things for time and, space and mind share. But music also does fuel us in a different way. I think that's where, it's always been the case. And I see it now. You mentioned you have kids earlier, and I have one daughter as well. And, seeing her discover her passion and connection for music in real time, and sort of trying not to be too much of a like laboratory scientist in my observations, but at the same time, kind of. Like, it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to see all of the circuits firing, and when they start to, hear the connections between different artists, and I might plan to see, like, it sounds like this might have the same producer, because we notice some patterns in what we're listening to, and then to hear her kind of understand what that means is really, it's awesome.
That is awesome. Yeah, I feel like you're speaking to just one of the great joys of having children in the first place, sort of vicariously living through them as they discover the world.
Not for everybody, but for me, it worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're talking about Gen AI, it's interesting. I've been pretty mind blown by AI in general, generative AI, both in terms of when ChatGPT came out, but also like some of the newer models with AI generative. Like at the time of recording this, there's like Udio.com and Suno.com. And like you mentioned, it's just the Wild West in terms of like the current landscape of it. There's been some legal questions around like, copyrights and is the training data, like, should we be able to use it? So we're still figuring out a lot of stuff. But
Absolutely.
my personal experience using it has mostly been having fun with my kids, and that, like, my 6-year-old son Xander, you can imagine what a 6-year-old boy with the power to create music about anything is going to create, which is dozens of songs about like Mr. Toilet Man and Poopy Butt,
Sure.
which it's actually it's fun. It's really fun to kind of create soundtracks and moments and to explore those tools. But
Yeah.
it does seem like, to your point, right now at the time of recording this, it's like just hard to predict, and the exponential change is happening so fast too that it's like, almost anything that we could say feels like 6 months later, things are going to have evolved quickly. I guess one question for you, having, you have so much experience and such background and kind of witnessing these evolutions of the music industry from different mediums. And on some level, like I think that it's sort of like we're surfers in the ocean, and there's these different waves that come, and like if you catch the wave at the right point, then wow, you can get like momentum from it. And if you're trying to catch a wave that passed 10 years ago, it's like, okay, well, that wave's already passed. So you kind of have to be, looking at what's the upcoming wave, and you can kind of get momentum temporarily. But ultimately, like the fundamental just concept of like catching the waves is something that happens continually. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, having witnessed these different waves and evolutions in the music industry, and also kind of like where things settle afterwards, or it's like, oh, it's kind of the way that it always has been, but now there's like this new thing. What's your perspective on this current wave with AI? Like, do you think that there's something fundamentally different about this as a specific like tool set compared to some of the previous evolutions with samples and drum machines? Like, does this feel like there's something fundamentally different, or is it just another example of just evolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. It does feel like it's different. I think it's different, as I mentioned, because hopefully we've learned from some of the efforts to throttle the evolution of technology as it impacts creativity. That wasn't great. And, the results of that were, I mean, this is probably a very strong word, but probably carnage. If you look at some of the decline that we saw in terms of not just the amount of money that music was making, but how it really impacted artists, and then how we sort of repositioned the return, and then artists have been sort of left out of that equation. And I think that is something different about this time. I would say, companies like CD Baby and the companies at Downtown that we support, we don't own any intellectual property. We are only the sort of administration partners, the distribution partners, the, creative partners to our customers. So that kind of, I think that transformation happening concurrently also has given us a chance to recalibrate things for artists to own more of their careers in a completely transformational way as well. And so, like, looking to the future where artists are going to make decisions about where they want to land in all of these changes more directly, and not just be sort of at the layer or two below, like, oh, my label and my distributor and all of these other people decided how we're going to work. Artists really do have the chance now to have that autonomy, if you will. And so I think that happening along with this transformation is something that's really new, and gives me, it doesn't mean that and certainly I think, probably from your experience too, most artists would prefer not to be burdened with the day-to-day management of the business decisions, right? Like, it's tedious. It's not fun. It's not the creative part until years in, if we're so lucky to have years into a career as a musician, that they were like, oh, well, I didn't sign up for that, And I think that what we're also seeing is now artists at earlier phases of their creative journey can be more informed, right? They know the information isn't at the layer of, oh, it's some executive in a corner suite who's determined how I'm going to be impacted. We really do have a whole different paradigm that we're available, been made available. It's more work, but it's different kinds of work. but I've maintained for lots of different parts of my career journey at different companies that I've worked at. And I've been fortunate that, for the last 10 years, I've been working in parts of the industry that really do support that autonomy and really do sort of support that recalibration of the music industry. So whether it was working at A2IN, which is the Independent Label Trade Association, sort of trying as the market share was redistributed to more indies than the major record companies, and then at Kickstarter, where I worked directly with artists and on their creative projects and try to fundraise for just making an album or making a record or whatever sort of ancillary project they might have related to music, but giving them the connection to their community through that platform, and then having a fair price for that service, and never taking the ownership away. It was still in their hands. And then at Songtrust and Downtown and CD Baby, where we are support at a much more structural level, but it's the same sort of way of working. So I think those are, really wonderful changes in the industry that, again, for some artists, they still prefer to work directly with a record company and that infrastructure. And, that makes sense I totally get why that makes sense for different artists. But I think it's wonderful to see changes. For example, we have an artist who decided to use the CD Baby platform to release her new single. She just cracked the Billboard Top 100.
Wow.
It's incredible. And, you just can't, I don't think that was something by any means available 30 years ago, or 20, or even, in certain cases, 10. Like, this is someone who just, with her management team, it's not like she doesn't have a team, but she has the control. And I love that so much.
That's awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like one of the unique things that's happening right now with this movement is what you're noticing is there's a shift in control or ability coming back to the hands of the creators and the people to actually have more ownership in what they're doing. And, there are some benefits to, being able to just let go of all the administrative business side of things and just focus on the music. That's a dream for a lot of artists, but never before has it been easier to actually take things into your own hands and actually be able to crack the Billboard 100 and to do that independently without a major record label. That's amazing.
That's right. And I feel like, that is also, kind of reframing the approach, right? That work, whether you're collaborating or you're writing your own music and you're recording it, whatever the sort of atmosphere of your creativity, it's an effort, right? I mean, it takes brain space, and I know that that's the preferred brain space for many artists. But I guess what I've been trying to sort of propose is that there's a rewarding value in the other part of supporting your career. And that is something that's, I hope that people, as they start to, and then as they build their careers, really do, see that value. And, I think that's what we're trying to propose, at CD Baby.
Awesome. There absolutely is a growing wave or growing trend of artists taking more ownership of their own careers and, like you're mentioning, finding joy and the creativity that comes from coming up with marketing ideas and building their business and connecting with their fans.
Sure. And that just reminded me, obviously, we have a whole different universe of access between the audience and the artist now too, right? With social media and direct communication. And I know that's intense. I mean, I think anyone, whether you're a musician or not, or any kind of person now feels the burden of the social media environment, but that's still, it's another opportunity as well, as long as you can maintain your mental health.
Absolutely. So this has been great. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective and kind of where things have come from as the music industry, where things are going. And the last question that I have for you is, as an artist who you might be listening or watching this right now, is sort of experiencing this golden age where they do have more opportunity on their own to be able to build a career and use a platform like CD Baby to be able to launch and potentially hit some of the top charts. And maybe they're also experiencing that simultaneous challenge of how do I cut through the noise when there's so much like different music? How do I do something unique? How do I actually build an audience?
Right.
I'd be curious how anyone that's listening or watching this right now, what do you recommend for an artist that hypothetically, let's say that they're early on, but they've recorded an EP or an album, and yeah, I know that CD Babies continue to evolve, like you talked about,
Yeah.
and you've continued
Yeah.
to adapt to the current tools, what's available. How can they best grow and be successful using the CD Baby platform? And what would your number one piece of advice be for them right now if they're just getting started and they have the music, but they're trying to build the audience?
Sure. I mean, I would say there's no formula, sadly, right? Like and if someone tells you there is, they're probably asking for you to write a check, which, is significantly more than it's probably worth at, that earliest stage. Personal recommendation, and like I said, this is one path, is to start as authentically as you possibly can, as genuinely as you possibly can to build your community. So you start where you are. You start by connecting with your social community. But, I see people, LA is unique, right? Because we have a lot of opportunities we have something called the Hotel Cafe, like right behind me on the street. There's a venue that has an open mic or, some kind of equivalent every Monday. And so I'm sure there are people who just go there because it's not that why not spend a few hours on a Monday? If you're going to spend it doing anything, you might hear something incredible, and that is not necessarily something that's in every town around the world, but there's something like that, and there's some way to build community. Obviously the internet and social media gives us chances to connect that are available to everyone, but it's a lot of effort. And so, but I guess that's my main thing. I mean, you start with what you have, you try to grow and build real connections and sort of credible and authentic support, and you try to build that into the places where people are consuming music, right? So whether it's the social platforms or it's the streaming platforms, that's my main recommendation. I think it seems to be distracting for a lot of early career artists to think more about placing a sync or something that's like a little more pie in the sky, when that could happen. No one's here to say it can't, but it's not the most likely way that you're going to build an audience. So, if you're a live performer or you're a DJ or you're electronic music, whatever obviously it's in that community that you will probably have the best chance of making those connections. So that's always, I'm kind of old school that way. It's like, there's probably many more bells and whistles and tricks and twists that you could apply, but I would apply those after you started, with the foundation.
Awesome. I mean, I feel like that's another really honest answer. And
I don't know any other way to be, Michael. Like I'm a punk rocker, so I don't have the probably for some more pie in the sky solutions. But I also don't think that that's. Listen, one of the things that's really hard probably for a lot of early career artists is to think that like there is one easy path and that, or there's no path. I think that there's obviously an in between. We see the data actually talking about, iconic artists even having to sort of build that middle phase of their career. So I think that is probably, versus thinking that you're going to be playing the halftime show at the Super Bowl as your goal, like what gives you the connection and energy to the music that you want to create? Is it an idea, a passion, a pain, whatever that you have to get out? That's probably going to give you the best path of connecting with other people, because we do all love music. We do all have, arguably most new songs aren't original ideas, right? They're mostly about heartbreak or love or whatever. It's like, they're just a new filter on a similar idea. So I think there's lots of room. And also trying to be, putting that passion with the craft, I don't think hurts. That there's always practice and energy and all of those things that, apply to your music that will help people connect with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a term that you shared there and throughout the conversation around like community and
Yeah.
building community and starting with where you are and not having to, yeah, like, especially nowadays with social media, it does kind of feel like we want a shortcut. We want a way to appear bigger than we necessarily are, especially at the very beginning. It's like a
Right.
big easy trap to fall into, and so I
Yeah.
really love the
Well,
advice. So
yeah, you
just like,
think you're like, if you're my kid, she's not a Swiftie really yet, but like obviously that's an iconic example of success. But
mm,
there are also other things. I'm trying to bring her to smaller shows because who wants to spend all that money necessarily?
mhm.
It's I'm happy for Taylor Swift to be so successful, but it's also like that's kind of bananas. And then there are also other places to experience music too, right? So anyway.
100%. Yeah, I mean, it seems like community is more important than ever because of the amount of division that we sort of feel like even though we have
Hmm.
social media, we're all like so connected, but we're also disconnected. And so I really appreciate the advice to start with where you're at and build authentically, build one person at a time. And I
Yeah.
don't know if you knew this about Modern Musician or my backstory, but our band, how we got started was we actually approached fans who were waiting in lines for shows, and we
Right.
introduced ourselves and we shared clips of our
Love that.
songs. And we did that for about 6 months, where all I did every day for like 6 months was walk up to fans waiting lines for shows. And that's how we sold 24,000 CDs starting from scratch doing that. And that led to us building a community of fans and being able
Yeah.
to tour for about 10 years. And it all came from exactly what you're describing, like really just that grassroots connection and building community.
Right.
And even if you're using the tools nowadays, the digital, like there's some awesome digital marketing tools, but it does come back to that foundation that you're describing of like
Yeah.
connecting with people and building
Yeah.
real community and authentic relationships. So yeah, that's great advice.
I love that too. And I'll be thinking about that too. I've only been in my job for 2 months, a little bit over 2 months. So, as we're plotting the, new ways to introduce what we do to the music creator community. I mean, I'll think about your story too.
Awesome. Yeah, if there's ever anything that I can do from Modern Musicians end to support CD Baby and what you're doing, I think we have certainly aligned values.
Great. Awesome.
Awesome. Well, Molly, thank you so much again for taking the time to
Thanks
be
for
here.
inviting me.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll come back in 6 months or a year and with an update.
Absolutely. And last question for anyone that's listening or watching this right now who would like to explore CD Baby and kind of get started and
Sure.
see what's the newest, newest offerings. Where can they go to dive deeper?
It's just cdbaby.com. There's also a website that we've maintained for many years called DIYmusician.com that has most of the sort of tactical content that we're, sort of always looking at new ways to present, all of the facts of the business and how to work within it. So those are the two easiest places to go, and all the social channels too.
All right. Awesome. Well, like always, we'll put the links in the show notes for easy access. And
Yes,
thanks
great.
for taking the time, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, great.
Yeah!